Nietzsche was a full professor when that was impossible. I think when he was 24, and that just never happened. And so his extraordinary genius was recognized very early, but he was also extraordinarily ill, sick physically. His dad died at about 40 of something they called softening of the brain, which was actually a fairly common diagnostic category back then. No one really knows what it was. Some people have suggested that he had syphilis from one sexual encounter, or that it was hereditary, but nobody really knows. But anyways, his father died young, and Nietzsche died very young as well. He was mentally incapacitated for the last few years of his life, and died after that. And so he could only serve as a professor for a while because he couldn't see very well, and he was always sick, and he ended up living in this little village, I believe in Switzerland, where he wrote his books, and he could only write a paragraph or two at a time before he became very ill. And so his writing is extraordinarily condensed and dense and brilliant, and I think he gave away, I think Beyond Good and Evil, which is his masterpiece, although he had many, I think it only sold 500 copies in his lifetime. So he also believed that he was only writing for himself. He didn't really know if anybody was ever going to pay any attention to what he said, but they certainly did. So I would say he ended up being certainly one of the 10 most influential people of the late 19th and earliest 20th century. This is an example of his writing. Of what is great, one must either be silent or speak with greatness. With greatness, that means cynically, and with innocence. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently. The advent of nihilism. Our whole European culture is moving for some time now with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as towards a catastrophe, restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that's afraid to reflect. He that speaks here has conversely done nothing so far but to reflect, as a philosopher and solitary by instinct, who has found his advantage in standing aside, outside. Why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Sorry about that. Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals. Because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value those values really had. We require at some time new values. Nihilism stands at the door, whence comes this uncanniest of all guests. Point of departure. This is a good example of how Nietzsche said he philosophized with a hammer, and it means that he spent hours, days, weeks, months concentrating on how to make a single sentence as packed with significance as he could possibly manage. And so Nietzsche said, it's the best arrogant statement I've ever read. He said, I can say in a sentence what it takes other people a whole book to say. And then he said what they can't say in a whole book. That's pretty good, eh? It's like the first one's a real blow to the solar plexus, and the second one is like, I can top that with no problem. Point of departure. It is an error to consider social distress or physiological degeneration or the corruption of all things as the cause of nihilism. That's a critique of the later Freudian ideas right there and then, because what Nietzsche says was, look, if things are going wrong for you, or if they're going wrong in general, it's really straightforward to say that, well, there's something wrong with society, that would be social distress, or there's some physiological degeneration, there's something wrong with you physically, or everything is just corrupted, being itself is corrupt. Which is a classic explanation, right? You hear that all the time. You think, well, people are suffering for one reason or another. Well, why? Well, there's something wrong biologically, or society is corrupted and everything is unfair. Nietzsche says, no, you're not going to get away with that. First, he says, ours is the most honest and compassionate age, comparing modern civilization, let's say, to everything that has come before it. So speaking of corruption is not something you can do lightly. And then he says, and this is remarkable, distress whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not at all produce nihilism. That is the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. Well, that's a rough one. It's like, well, you had a rough childhood. Well, someone else who had your childhood might not have drawn those conclusions. So here's an example. You know that most people who abused children were abused by as children, right? But most people who were abused as children do not grow up to abuse children. And you can figure that out arithmetically, because if it was the case that everyone abused grew up to abuse, in about 4 generations everyone would be being beat to death in childhood as a matter of course, because it would spread exponentially. That isn't what happens. It dampens. And why is that? Well, if you're bullied as a child, we could say, well, you could draw 2 conclusions, causal conclusions. Being bullied caused me to be a bully. Fair enough, man, that's an understandable story. How about being bullied caused me not ever to be a bully? Well, why is that any less reasonable a conclusion? It's frequently one that people draw, and since the 2 opposite conclusions can be drawn from the same set of experiences, you cannot say that the experiences caused the conclusions.